When a woman returned to her old New York City apartment, she made a terrifyingly grisly discovery in the kitchen. From cruel torture to desperate survival, these are the true stories of cannibalism throughout history. During the 1960s, Mao Zedong kicked off China's Cultural Revolution in an attempt to secure power. The movement pitted citizen against citizen, and as many as 2 million people died. And then, in 1993, the New York Times reported on recently released documents detailing widespread cannibalism, practiced as a way for revolutionaries to demonstrate their superiority over their defeated enemies. The contents of the documents included descriptions of students who killed, cooked, and ate authority figures at their schools. Participation in this butchery was seen as a way to demonstrate solidarity with the cause. Bodies were reportedly strung up in government-funded cafeterias with their flesh served to workers. Reports suggested that at least 137 people were killed and eaten, while it also estimated that their flesh and organs were distributed to thousands of people. These atrocities were brought to light largely by one person, writer and activist Zhang Yi, who had already incurred the wrath of Chinese officials for his involvement in the Tiananmen Square protests. He used his access to Communist Party records to not only document what happened, but to also find and speak with those who had participated in the slaughter. He wrote a book on his findings and began living in exile in the United States. The story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 serves as the basis for the harrowing 1993 film Alive. On October 13, 1972, a plane carrying an amateur rugby team from the South American country crashed in an area of the Andes Mountains called the Valley of Tears. The 16 survivors ultimately wouldn't be rescued until 2 days before Christmas. One of those survivors was Roberto Cabeza, who went on to become one of his country's top pediatric cardiologists. Just 19 years old, he was a medical student at the time, which meant he not only moved the bodies of the dead, but also carved the flesh for eating. As he recalled to National Geographic in 2016, "I thought if I were killed, I would feel proud that my body could be used for others to survive. I feel that I shared a piece of my friends not only materially, but spiritually, because their will to live was transmitted to us through their flesh." After the survivors were rescued, Cabeza visited the families of every person who had died in the accident. None of them judged him for what they did to make it out alive. In 1514, Gyorgy Dozsa led an army of peasants in a revolt against the Hungarian nobility, and he came close to winning it all. As recounted in the book The History of Hungary and the Magyars, when he was finally captured, he was mocked with the promise of a crown, which he got in red-hot form right off the smithy's forge. Dozsa was also given a throne that was just as hot, although the text doesn't note whether or not it was hot enough to cook the flesh that was sliced from his body while he was still alive. Those pieces were thrown to 14 other men who had been captured along with him. As punishment for their decision to follow the rebel leader, they were ordered to eat him. Refusal to cannibalize their leader was punishable by death, but it's entirely possible that the offer was easier than it sounded, as the men hadn't been given food for the 10 days leading up to the gruesome execution. They were also reportedly commanded to dance while Dozsa was executed, beheaded, and quartered. In 1819, Irishman Alexander Pearce was sent to Australia after conviction for stealing boots. He was sentenced to a series of lashings and hard labor for a variety of crimes until finally being sent to the Macquarie Harbour penal settlement. While he was there, Pearce formed an unlikely alliance with 7 other convicts. The men escaped together and set off across hostile, unforgiving territory. It's the sort of place that still has a dangerous reputation today, and for ill-equipped fugitives in the early 19th century, it was deadly, especially considering the biggest threat was traveling with them. The group made it 15 days with no food before they drew straws to see which of them would be killed and eaten first. After the first round of cannibalism, one man took off on his own and another died of exhaustion. One by one, the others were killed until only Pearce remained. And since no one believed the story he told when he was captured again, he was sent back to Macquarie, only to escape once more, this time in the company of a man named Thomas Cox. When Pearce was recaptured yet again, it was easier to believe his story about killing and eating Cox, as bits of him were still in Pearce's pockets. He was ultimately tried, found guilty, and hanged. His skull is currently part of a collection at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology.
And then he became a murderer and finally ended up cannibalism and getting hung.
Herman Melville's 1851 novel Moby Dick was inspired by an actual incident. The real-life Captain Ahab was a man named Captain George Pollard Jr., whom Melville met after the publication of his book. Pollard and his whaleship Essex set sail in 1819 on a 2.5-year trip that was almost immediately beset by misfortune. The ship's troubles culminated in a November 1820 incident when a whale caught sight of the ship and rammed it, smashing a massive hole in the side. The 20 men on board split up into 3 boats, but they didn't head for the nearest set of islands, as they were convinced that the natives were cannibals. So instead, they headed out into the open ocean, where their provisions quickly ran out and they continued to be harassed by the whales they'd set out to hunt. First mate Owen Chase would later describe what happened to the first man to die, as he wrote, "We separated limbs from his body and cut all the flesh from the bones, after which we opened the body, took out the heart, and then closed it again. sewed it up as decently as we could, and committed it to the sea. The days dragged on, and the men ate others as they died. When there were no dead men left, they drew straws. Pollard's nephew drew short, and he was executed and eaten. The men in Chase's boat were rescued after 89 days, while Pollard and one other survivor were rescued a week after that.
3 months in an open boat.
Yeah, I mean that's an entire summer.
Yeah, right. In 1989, Daniel Rakowitz was looking for a new roommate in New York City. As local squatter Jerry the Peddler recalled to the Village Voice, he was a classic nut. He had all the symptoms. He had sudden fits of rage, he had delusions of grandeur, he didn't like touching people, he had fantasy followers. The new roommate ended up being a Swiss dancer named Monica Beerley. Later, Rakowitz's former roommate Sylvia stopped by to get some of her things. As Sylvia recounted to the Village Voice, "I went to the kitchen, and on the stove there was a pot, and in the pot was Monica's head. She was all burnt up and her eyes were closed. The rest of Beerley's remains were found in the bathtub." Rakowitz told Sylvia that he had no choice and admitted that he'd eaten at least part of her brain. There were also other pieces of flesh that he'd stored in the freezer. Even worse was that Rakowitz was known for collecting donations of food and cooking massive meals for the homeless living in Tompkins Square, which is why it started circulating that he'd slipped some human meat into the meals. He was ultimately found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity, and in 2004, another jury determined that he was mentally ill but not dangerous. Upon the discovery of 15,000-year-old remains in Gough's cave in Somerset, England in the 1980s, it was quickly determined that the bones belonged to individuals whose bodies had been butchered and then eaten. But it took a few more decades to unlock more of the secrets these ancient ancestors had taken to the grave. It wasn't until 2017 that analysts were able to show that some of the distinctive cut marks weren't practical but decorative. That led researchers to conclude that this ancient group of hunter-gatherers had former rituals around their cannibalism. A large percentage of the bones also featured bite marks, and over the years since the initial discovery, more remains have been found. In 2011, The Guardian reported on the discovery of 3 cups made from human skulls, including one that came from a child who was about 3 years old. There's another school of thinking that suggests that this cannibalism had a practical side as well. The bones had been dated to the last ice age, and the fact that they were butchered using the same techniques revealed by patterns on animal bones has led to the conclusion that regardless of the motives, cannibalism helped humans survive during that era.
We recognize cut marks, percussion damage, and even human tooth mark.
When European explorers started enslaving their way through the New World, their justifications for doing so included rumors that the indigenous peoples practiced cannibalism, and therefore the thinking went they needed a firm European influence to change their ways. It's worth noting then that the first recorded instance of cannibalism in the New World happened among the Spanish explorers under Alvar Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca's men traveled from Florida and ended up in what's now Galveston, Texas. They called it the Island of Doom. 5 of the men became separated from the others, and they eventually resorted to eating each other. As Cabeza de Vaca wrote, the Indians were so shocked at this cannibalism that if they had seen it sometime earlier, they surely would have killed every one of us. If the natives had done that, they might have lived. The Spanish explorers carried diseases with them, and about half of the indigenous people who helped them survive this ordeal died themselves. It's an all-told tale that America was founded by people who were brave, adventure-seeking, and unbelievably tough, but somewhat lesser known is how some of them resorted to cannibalism. When the English first settled Jamestown in the colony of Virginia in 1607, they were woefully ill-prepared for life in the New World. Starvation came quickly, and it wasn't long before they resorted to desperate measures. George Pearce was one settler who lived there during the period known as the Starving Time, and he wrote in his journal about the practice of digging up corpses to eat. His wasn't the only account of cannibalism in Jamestown, but it wasn't until an archaeological dig in 1994 that actual physical evidence of the practice was discovered. In 2013, National Geographic reported on the discovery of the remains of a 14-year-old girl that were recovered from a trash pit dated to the Starving Time. Researchers named her Jane, and her skull and leg bones showed distinct marks associated with the butchering of animals for food. They were able to determine that her face, tongue, and brain had been eaten. It was also clear that the cut marks were hesitant, which indicates that they were made by someone who didn't want to do what they were doing, but had no choice.
Nothing to eat, so the monster of hunger is loose.
The idea of a Northwest Passage was a tantalizing one, and in 1845, Sir John Franklin and his crew of 128 men on 2 ships set out to find it, but then nobody saw any of them ever again. The ships carried food that was meant to last up to 7 years, as the crew fully expected to be stuck along the way. But by the spring of 1848, 24 people had died, and survivors decided to start walking to safety. The problem was that it was about 1,000 miles to the nearest trading post, with hardly any food sources along the way. In the years since, remains from the crew have been found, and a close study of the bones confirmed that some bore evidence of cannibalism. Specifically, they showed signs of something called pot polishing, which which happens when bones are broken and boiled to extract the last of the marrow. The findings support eyewitness accounts from the Inuit travelers who reported seeing piles of broken human bones that were boiled long after the meat was gone.